The August heat pressed down like a weight, thick with dust and silence, when Titan, the K9, froze at the edge of the pasture. His ears pricked, his muscles tensed, and then, slowly, he padded toward the crumbling stone well that everyone in town whispered about but never touched. Officer Mason, trailing behind, felt the hair on his arms rise as Titan sat, rigid, staring into the black throat of the earth. The dog whined once, low and mournful. Mason stepped closer, peering down. Something caught the light, something pale, tangled, and wrong. And in that moment, the town's buried secrets began to stir. The heat was merciless that afternoon, the kind that made the wooden planks of the old barns warp and moan. The pasture grass lay brittle, crunching under boots as Officer Mason trudged behind Titan, who moved with unusual purpose. "Slow down, boy," Mason muttered, tugging gently on the leash. The K9 ignored him, a low growl vibrating through his chest. The abandoned well was just ahead, its weathered stones collapsed in places, the rim wrapped in weeds. Nobody went near it anymore. Farmers said it was cursed, bad luck to even stand too close. Mason didn't believe in curses, but he believed in Titan. The dog sat down, staring intently at the black mouth of the well, head tilted slightly as if listening. Mason wiped sweat from his brow, crouched, and followed the gaze downward. For a moment, he saw only darkness. Then something shifted, catching the sunlight. His throat tightened. It was hair, long, pale strands, swaying slightly in the stale air rising from below. Mason froze. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Mason. I need backup at the old Miller property, Southfield. Possible body in the well." The line crackled. "Copy that. Backup en route." Titan let out another low whine. Mason's hand instinctively went to the dog's head. Though his own pulse was pounding so hard, he could barely think straight. The first deputy to arrive was Jordan Hayes, young and eager, his uniform still stiff from the academy. He parked his cruiser crooked in the field and jogged over, squinting against the sun. "What do we have?" Hayes asked, peering into the well. Mason's jaw flexed. "Hair. Looks human." Hayes swallowed. "Christ." He leaned forward too far, pebbles skittering loose under his boots. Titan growled, teeth flashing. "Back up," Mason snapped. "Don't fall in. We wait until search and rescue gets here with the rig." Hayes nodded, pale. His bravado seemed to shrink by the second. The two men stood in silence, the cicadas buzzing so loud it felt deafening. Mason's eyes kept flicking to the well, unwilling to look but unable to turn away. He knew the whispers about this land. Kids had gone missing decades back, unsolved. Farmers spoke of screams at night, but those were just stories. Weren't they? Search and rescue arrived with ropes, lights, and a winch system. The well was narrow, dangerous, its stones slick with moss. Mason stayed near Titan, who never once moved his gaze from the opening. A rescuer lowered a light. "Got something," he called, his voice echoing strangely up the stone shaft. "Looks like, yeah, it's a body. Female." Mason's gut clenched. Minutes later, they began pulling the form upward. A tangle of wet hair emerged first, then a thin arm, pale as bone. The rescuers worked in grim silence, until finally the body was laid out on the grass. Gasps rippled to the gathered officers. The woman couldn't have been dead more than a few days. But the well, Mason knew it hadn't been opened in years. "Impossible," Hayes whispered. Mason crouched beside the corpse, studying the face. Young, no more than 20. Dirt and algae clung to her skin, but her expression was strangely serene, lips parted as if she'd been whispering secrets when she died. One of the rescuers crossed himself. Another muttered, "God help us." Mason stood slowly, scanning the horizon. The land was empty, quiet, too quiet. Who had put her here? And why did Titan know to find her? Back at the station, the body was transferred to the coroner. Mason remained behind to file the initial report, but his mind wasn't on the paperwork. He kept seeing the pale strands of hair waving in the dark, like a signal meant only for him. Sheriff Coleman entered the office, a broad man with eyes too sharp to ever fully trust. He leaned against the desk, watching Mason's pen scratch across the page. "You're rattled," Coleman said. "Wouldn't you be?" Mason replied without looking up. The sheriff grunted. "I've seen worse. You'll see worse, too. This town doesn't like to give up its ghosts." Mason met his gaze. There was something in Coleman's tone, something heavy, unspoken. "You know something." Coleman didn't flinch. "I know people talk. That well's been bad luck since before you were born. Some say it's a dumping ground. Some say it's worse than that. You don't actually believe that." "I believe this," Coleman said, voice low. "A body turns up in that well. People in this town will start asking questions they don't want answered. You do well to remember that." Mason stiffened. "So we just... what? Pretend it didn't happen?" "Of course not." Coleman's eyes hardened. "But you keep your head, and you watch who you trust." That night, Mason couldn't sleep. Titan paced restlessly at the foot of the bed, ears twitching at every creak in the house. Outside, the fields were silver with moonlight, the well just a dark smudge in the distance. Mason's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A whisper crackled through the line. "Stop digging, officer. Some things are meant to stay buried." The call went dead. Mason sat frozen, the phone pressed against his ear. His chest tightened. His gut twisted. Someone was watching. Titan growled, low and steady, staring at the window as if he saw someone just beyond the glass. Mason moved slowly, lifting the curtain. The yard lay empty, silent. But in the far distance, near the line of trees, he thought he saw a shadow move. And he knew then the well wasn't just a grave. It was a warning. The morning came gray and heavy, as though the sky itself wanted no part in what lay beneath it. Mason stood by the station's window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the main street wake slowly. Trucks rumbling past, the bakery's neon sign flickering, children dragging backpacks toward the school bus. On the surface, it was an ordinary small-town day. But Mason couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, pale and serene, pulled from the well like some kind of offering. Titan lay near the desk, restless, his eyes snapping open at the slightest sound. Mason had learned long ago to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. Last night, Titan had stared at the window for hours, ears sharp, chest vibrating with a low growl. Something, or someone, had been out there. Mason hadn't slept. A knock on his office door broke his thoughts. Sheriff Coleman stepped inside, holding a manila folder. "Autopsy came back," Coleman said flatly. Mason took the folder, skimming the first page. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Not drowning, not trauma, just suffocation. Any sign of struggle? Mason asked. Coleman shook his head. None. No bruises. No defensive wounds. The coroner says it looks like she just stopped breathing. That doesn't make sense. Mason flipped the pages, frustration prickling. She wasn't in that well for years. Her body was almost intact. Coleman studied him. "You're thinking what I'm thinking." Mason closed the folder. She was alive when she went in. The sheriff's silence was confirmation enough. Later that afternoon, Mason drove out to the Miller property with Titan riding shotgun. The well sat at the far edge of the field, weeds bending around its stones like hands trying to pull it back into the earth. Mason leaned against the cruiser, watching Titan circle the well. The dog stopped, nose pressed against the ground, tail stiff. He barked once, sharp, insistent. "What is it, boy?" Mason crouched, examining the dirt, tracks fresh ones. Someone had been here after the rescue team left. The prints led toward the tree line. Mason followed, Titan straining at the leash. The woods were thick, shadows dripping between the branches, the air damp with rot. Every snap of a twig made Mason's grip tighten on his sidearm. After 20 yards, the tracks disappeared. But something else caught his eye, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, fluttering in the breeze. He pulled it free. A torn piece of denim, stained dark. Blood. His radio crackled. "Mason, you there?" It was Hayes. "Go ahead. You might want to get back to town." The dead girl. Someone just ID'd her. Name's Lily Harper. College kid, back home for summer. Parents reported her missing 3 days ago. Mason's stomach dropped. 3 days. That lined up with the coroner's estimate. Where do they live? He asked. Edge of town near the lumber mill. Mason pocketed the bloody fabric and turned back toward the cruiser. Titan growled, nose still to the ground, but Mason tugged him along. Answers waited in town. The Harper house sat hunched at the end of Gravel Drive, shutters sagging, the yard overgrown. Lily's mother answered the door, eyes red and hollow, her voice frayed. You found her, she whispered, as though saying it out loud made it worse. Yes, ma'am, Mason said gently. I'm sorry for your loss. She stepped aside, letting him in. The living room smelled of stale coffee and grief. A photograph of Lily sat on the mantel. Bright smile, blonde hair, a life unspoiled by shadows. She went out 2 nights ago, Mrs. Harper said, wringing her hands. Said she was meeting a friend. Never came back. What friend? Mason asked. I don't know. She wouldn't say. A man's voice cut in. Lily's father appeared from the hallway, his face hard. You gonna find who did this, or just ask questions you don't plan to answer? Mason held his gaze. We'll find them. I promise. The man's jaw tightened. Promises don't mean much around here. Outside, Mason leaned against his cruiser, rubbing his temples. The case wasn't adding up. No signs of struggle. No water in her lungs. Just a girl who vanished one night and turned up in a well that hadn't been touched in decades. Titan barked suddenly, jerking toward the street. Mason followed his line of sight. A man stood half a block away, watching them. Tall, wiry, a ball cap pulled low. When he saw Mason looking, he turned and walked quickly down the street, disappearing around the corner. Mason started after him. But by the time he reached the corner, the street was empty. That night, Mason sat at the station reviewing files. Old reports, yellow with age. Missing persons. Names that never had answers. Some were kids, some drifters. But one report stopped him cold. June 12, 1989, female mid-20s. Last seen near the Miller property. Unsolved. Mason stared at the page, the words blurring. That was the same property with the well. The phone rang, startling him. He answered. A familiar whisper slid through the line. You should have left it alone. The connection cut. Mason slammed the receiver down, blood roaring in his ears. Someone was playing with him. Someone who knew too much. The next day, Mason met Hayes outside the diner. The young deputy looked shaken. Got something, Hayes said quietly. Not here. Come on. They walked to Hayes' truck. He opened the glove compartment, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. Found this slipped under my windshield this morning, Hayes said, handing it over. Mason unfolded it. A grainy photograph stared back. The well, and beside it, last night, Mason himself, standing with Titan. His throat went dry. Where'd this come from? I told you. Windshield. No one saw a thing. Mason crumpled the photo in his fist. Someone was watching them. Close enough to take pictures. Bold enough to leave threats. Hayes' voice dropped lower. Mason, what if it's someone inside the apartment? Mason stared at him. The thought had gnawed at the edges of his mind since Coleman's warning. Watch who you trust. Keep this quiet, Mason said. Tell no one. That evening, Mason drove back toward the Miller property. He didn't tell Dispatch. He didn't tell Coleman. Just him and Titan. The dog's ears twitching, body tense. The field stretched wide, bathed in dying light. The well stood like a scar against the earth. Mason approached slowly, scanning the horizon. Then he saw it. Fresh flowers laid at the edge of the well. White lilies. Someone had been here today. Mason's chest tightened. He crouched, picking up a bloom. The petals were damp, still cool. A sound rose from the well. Soft, breathing. Mason froze. He leaned closer, straining his ears. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was alive down there. Hello, he called, his voice sharp. Who's there? No answer. Just that faint, ragged breathing. Titan barked furiously, pulling at the leash. Mason dropped the flower, gripping the stones of the well. "Hold on," he shouted down. "I'll get help." But as he turned, a voice stopped him cold. "Don't." Mason spun. A figure stepped from the tree line. The same tall man with the cap. He held a shotgun casually in his hands, like it belonged there. "You pull her up," the man said calmly, "and you'll regret it." Mason's pulse thundered. "She's alive." The man smiled faintly. "Not for long." Titan lunged, teeth bared, but Mason held him back. The man raised a shotgun, the setting sun painting his face in streaks of fire and shadow. Mason realized then, this wasn't just about Lily Harper. The well was older than her, older than all of them, and someone had been feeding it for years. The man with the shotgun didn't flinch. The dying sun washed his weathered face in copper and crimson, shadows pooling in the lines around his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. Mason knew that look. Titan's growls rumbled low, vibrating through the leash. "Put the gun down," Mason said carefully, one hand raised, the other hovering near his holster. "Nobody needs to get hurt." The man tilted his head, the faintest smile curling his lips. "You think this is about hurting people? You don't get it, officer. That well isn't just a hole in the ground. It's a door, and doors need sacrifices." Mason's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Every few years," the man said calmly, "it wakes. And if you don't give it something, it takes more. You've seen the missing cases, haven't you? All those unsolved files. That's not coincidence. That's balance. You expect me to believe some fairy tale?" Mason snapped. The man's eyes burned with something beyond madness, conviction. "Believe what you want. But if you drag her up, you'll invite worse than death into this town. We've kept it fed, kept it quiet. That's why the town still stands." Mason's stomach turned. "Who's we?" The man didn't answer. He just raised the shotgun a fraction higher. And then Titan lunged. The dog tore free of Mason's grip, leaping with a snarl. The man fired. The blast echoed across the field, birds exploding from the trees. Titan yelped, twisting midair, but still crashed into man, knocking him backward. The shotgun clattered away. Mason was on him in an instant, wrestling him into the dirt, adrenaline surging hot. Titan staggered, bleeding from his shoulder, but still bared his teeth, pressing in. Mason wrenched a man's arm behind his back, shoving his knee into his spine. "Who's helping you?" he barked. "Who's been feeding that well?" The man spat dirt, laughing hoarsely. "Ask your sheriff." Mason froze. The words cut through the haze like a blade. He looked down at the man's face, twisted in pain but still grinning. "Sheriff Coleman," the man rasped. "He's the one who keeps it going. Always has. Family tradition." Mason's grip faltered for half a second. The man wrenched free just enough to slam his head back into Mason's nose. Pain burst white. Mason reeled, clutching his face. The man scrambled up, bolting for the trees. "Titan, go!" Mason shouted. The K-9, limping but fierce, charged after him into the dark. They never caught him. By the time Mason staggered into the woods, flashlight beams slicing through branches, the man was gone. Titan returned minutes later, panting, bleeding, empty-jawed. Mason crouched, pressing a hand to the dog's wound. "Easy, boy. Easy." His own nose throbbed, blood dripping hot down his chin, but his thoughts burned on Coleman's name. Back at the cruiser, he radioed Hayes. "Meet me at the station. Now!" The station smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. Hayes paced the floor, eyes wide as Mason told him what happened. "You're saying Coleman's in on this?" Hayes whispered. "I'm saying," Mason replied grimly, "he's hiding something. And if that bastard in the woods was telling the truth, Coleman's been covering this up for decades." Hayes swallowed. "That doesn't make sense. Coleman's tough, sure, but he's not a murderer." Mason slammed the bloody scrap of denim onto the desk. "Explain this, then." "Fresh blood by the well. Flowers left on the edge. Someone alive down there. Hayes, this isn't just some lunatic story. Something's been going on for years, and Coleman knows more than he lets on." The deputy's voice trembled. "So what do we do?" Mason's jaw hardened. "We go to him. Tonight. before he buries this deeper. Coleman's house sat on the outskirts of town, lights glowing faintly in the windows. Mason and Hayes parked 2 streets over, approaching on foot. Titan moved at Mason's side, stiff but determined despite his wound. Through the kitchen window, Coleman sat at the table, a whiskey glass in hand, staring at nothing. The man looked tired, too tired for someone carrying so much power. Mason motioned Hayes to circle left, then rapped on the door. After a pause, Coleman opened it, brows furrowing. What the hell's this? Mason pushed past him, hand hovering near his gun. We need to talk. Coleman sighed, shutting the door. This about the well? Mason spun. So you admit it? Coleman's jaw tightened. He poured another drink, took a long swallow, then set the glass down hard. You think this job's about law and order, Mason? It's not. It's about keeping people safe the only way you can. Sometimes that means making choices you don't like. Mason's pulse hammered. What choices? Coleman's eyes gleamed. You think it's coincidence this town survived every drought, every fire, every storm? You think it's luck that crime never really sticks here? We've been giving the well what it asks for since before I was born. My father did it. His father before him. That's insane, Mason snapped. You're justifying murder. I'm justifying survival. Coleman leaned in, voice low. You saw Lily. Peaceful. No struggle. No pain. It takes them quiet. And in return, the town prospers. It's the balance we keep. Mason shook his head, rage boiling. You put kids in that hole. You call that balance. Coleman didn't blink. You don't have to like it. But if you fight it, Mason, you'll doom everyone here. Hayes shifted uneasily near the wall, his hand twitching near his holster. Mason glanced at him. The deputy's face was pale, torn. Hayes, Mason said firmly. You're not buying this, are you? Hayes didn't answer. Mason's gut sank. Coleman smiled faintly. You're young, Hayes. You still believe in good and evil. But you'll learn. You can be part of this. Or you can stand in the way. Hayes' hand trembled on his belt. Don't, Mason warned. Think for yourself. But Hayes' eyes darted to Coleman, like a son looking to a father. And Mason knew. The betrayal came in silence. Hayes drew his gun. Sorry, he whispered, but he's right. Mason barely had time to move. Titan lunged again, snarling, teeth sinking into Hayes' wrist. The gun fired wild, shattering a lamp. Coleman roared, reaching for his own weapon. Mason dove, slamming into Coleman, both men crashing into the table, whiskey spilling. They grappled, fists, knees, the sheriff's grip like iron. Mason's hand found a shard of broken glass and drove it hard into Coleman's arm. The man howled. Titan dragged Hayes down, the young deputy crying out, gun skittering across the floor. Mason pinned Coleman, breathing hard, fury burning hot. It ends now. Coleman spat blood, eyes blazing. You think killing me stops it? The well will keep taking, with or without us. But Mason didn't kill him. He yanked the sheriff's cuffs from his belt, snapping them around his wrists. Hayes lay groaning, Titan standing over him, teeth bared. The house stank of sweat, blood, and whiskey. By dawn, the truth was out. Coleman arrested, Hayes suspended. The FBI brought in. Excavations began at the Miller property. They pulled more bodies from the well. Too many, some decades old, some recent. All the town's whispers and missing cases laid bare under the morning sun. The townsfolk gathered silently, horror etched in their faces. The luck of their town was paid in blood, and now everyone knew it. Mason stood apart, Titan at his side, bandaged but proud. Reporters swarmed, but he ignored them. His eyes lingered on the well, now roped off, a dark throat gaping against the sky. One of the rescuers muttered, "There'll be more down there. Mark my words." Mason said nothing. He didn't want to know how deep it went. That evening, Mason returned home, bone-tired. Titan curled at his feet, muzzle on his paws, eyes heavy. The house was quiet, but not empty. For the first time since this began, Mason felt something close to peace. He poured water into Titan's bowl, kneeling beside him. The dog licked his hand, warm and loyal. Mason whispered, "You saved me, boy. Saved us all." Outside, the wind swept across the fields, rustling the grass. The well sat in silence, watched over now by floodlights and crime tape. But Mason knew silence didn't mean sleep. The town would never forget, and neither would he. Final resolution. Weeks later, when the town tried to return to normal, Mason walked Titan past the old property one last time. The field smelled of dust and summer rain. Children's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere distant, free of fear. Mason paused, staring at the sealed well. For all Coleman's words about balance, Mason had chosen something else, truth, no matter how painful. And though the well's shadow still lingered, it no longer owned him. He scratched Titan's ear, voice soft. Sometimes survival isn't about what you feed, it's about what you stop. And then he walked away, the dog at his side, leaving the past buried where it belonged.